Hello, welcome to episode 125 of the Book Binge, where this is episode 1 of my 2023 reading tier list, where I do a tier list of everything that I read over the year of 2023. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to be doing 4 videos of this, one today, and then the next 3 over the next few Thursdays, obviously going until, I believe, the 1st of February that the last one will come out, but there will be 4 of these videos. I read about 43 books over 2023, and then there were 3 things that I got to work on a little bit but didn't fully finish. We'll obviously talk about that a little bit more as time goes on. So here we are in the actual tier list itself for my 2023 reading. Now, just a couple disclaimers before we get started. I will go ahead and say that I have every right to adapt my list as things go on, so the way that I end the ranking in this first video may not necessarily be the exact way all of those items are placed at the very end of the 4th tier list, for example. And second, these aren't necessarily a ranking. I will be ranking the books within the tiers, and I can be a sort of ranking, but not everything is completely definitive. Just because I'm ranking something in cream of the crop and another book is in pretty dang good, the second tier, doesn't necessarily mean that I think the book in cream of the crop is a better book than pretty dang good, or vice versa, that the book in pretty dang good is worse than what's in cream of the crop. This is based mostly on my enjoyment of the books. There are, some objective measures that I try to include in my explanation for the ranking, and sometimes those objective metrics affect how I enjoy a book. But generally speaking, this is a little bit more subjective versus as objective as it could possibly be, for example. But with that being said, let's actually go into the tier list itself. Let's start off with Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 2, a book that last year I had basically in this not enough time, and that was because I didn't actually have time to read it last December. What ended up happening was I barely finished Demon in White in December of 2022. And so Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 2 ended up being over the first 3 days or so of January of 2023. Now, I would say that at the time that I first read this, it was probably my least favorite thing in Sun Eater, alongside Queen of Mid-Ashes and Empire of Silence, maybe even my least favorite of all of the Sun Eater releases. So for me, I was going to go ahead and say, better luck next time. It's good enough and had some stories in it that were enjoyable in the way that's yeah, this is Rockyo, it's Sun Eater, it's good, definitely read it, at least don't skip it, or don't intentionally skip it, go ahead and give it a shot, because there's some important stuff in here for later books. And so this is where I would have put it last when I read it the first time. I did end up reading it over the course of the year, as I will explain a little bit later. That would change things a little bit, but that will belong to a separate item on the list again later. Next up was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, my first completed book of the year, my first completed novel of the year by Jules Verne, and my first Jules Verne book that I actually finished. This was a book that I read partially in 8th grade. About halfway through, I remember enjoying what I read a lot, but I didn't end up finishing it for one reason or another, even though I tried to continue at various different points. But I wasn't really in that mood at the time, and I was really bad about actually finishing books at this period in my life. But I did go back and read the full thing earlier this year, and thought that what I enjoyed held up, and that there was stuff in the second half that was even better than the first half, which was already quite good. There were parts about it that were relatively dry, particularly the more biological description type of sections during the book. So I'm going to put 20,000 Leagues in pretty dang good. It is a very good book. I enjoyed it a lot. It's one of my personal favorites, most especially for the tone. But it is by no means a perfect book, and there are plenty of people who didn't love this book when we did it for the monthly classics read along, and that was the January book. That's obviously why I read it at that point. But there was also some people who have read other Verne who read the book, and it was far from their favorite of Verne, which is actually kind of encouraging for me, because maybe that means I'll enjoy other Verne books even more than I enjoyed this one already. Next up was Kingdoms of Death, a book that took me a little bit longer than I wanted for it to, because I took a couple weeks where I wasn't really reading much in January and February. But when I did finally read and finish this book, it absolutely devastated me. It is the darkest thing in Sun Eater to date, with only one thing really coming close. Both in terms of the actual content itself and in terms of the themes and the ideas that Christopher is trying to discuss and play with in using some of those darker actual material, if any of that sentence made sense. It was a book that was quite good. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if I would in fact, I don't think I rank it in my top 3 favorite Sun Eater books, but that just kind of goes to show how good Sun Eater is, where a book that I would consider basically perfect doesn't even end up in the top 3 of the series because all of the others are just so good. I'm going to put this in cream of the crop because Sun Eater is just amazing, and by this point, Christopher has hit his stride, not just in the storytelling, but also in his prose, because Kingdoms of Death is when I first noticed that the prose of the series was actually getting really good. Next up, I have H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. This was a very short book that I read for the monthly classics for February. This was one that had some good ideas and explored some ideas in ways that I really appreciated, and had, some imagery near the end towards, some of the climactic moments that I really liked and thought were really cool to explore, and that I wasn't really expecting from a book as old as this. I had some certain problems with the setting, and particularly the way the version of the book that I own, what time it's actually set at, just how many years in the future the time machine portion actually takes place in, because apparently there are different versions of the book depending on where you find it that take place at different points in time for some reason. But yeah, the version that I had, there were some aspects that I didn't find believable enough that I thought were pretty okay. The book overall held up a lot better than I thought it would when I first read it, but overall I don't look back on this like super incredibly fondly. It's a book that I would consider, worth the time of reading for the legacy of it, and because it is an early science fiction novel, and so it's not going to age perfectly anyway, but it is worth reading because the fact that it was one of the earlier books in the time travel type of idea of science fiction kind of gives you an idea of where the trope kind of came from and how it was used. Next up is the next book of Sun Eater, the final book in the series that is fully published at this point, Ashes of Man. Book 6 actually comes out in just a couple of months. From the time of this video's release, about 2.5 months, although at the time of this video's release, the E-Arc might be coming out in just a few days. I don't actually recall what day. I think it's like within 5 or 6 days will be when the E-Arc, Bane's E-Arc for the book will actually go on sale. I'm very excited for that. Part of that is because of how much I enjoyed Ashes of Man. I think Ashes of Man is pretty much perfect. At the time that I read it, I said it dethroned Les Mis by Victor Hugo as my favorite book of all time, and although now I would say that the two of them are basically tied, I still hold it in very high regard, so it's kind of easy for me to put it there at the top of cream of the crop already. Just Rockio on a whole nother level, well above the competition at this point of 2023. Ashes of Man is incredible, and both Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man absolutely destroyed me emotionally, and anybody who has read the books understands exactly why. Moving on to Wuthering Heights, a book that I really loved while I was reading it, a book that I would put like at the top of pretty dang good, maybe even the bottom of cream of the crop at the time that I read it, but more time that goes on since I finished it, especially since the last quarter or so of the book really started to wear me down a little bit, and I think part of this is my own fault because I binged it so hard after loving the first act, the first half of the book basically, but the more that I think about it after I've finished, the more months that pass, the more time that goes by, and the more often I think about this book after the fact, the less I like it. So I'm going to put it not here and not here, but I'm actually going to put it here, because although I loved reading it while I was reading it, there were a lot of problems that I have with the book, thinking back on it, that only make it sour on me over time, and as such there were also some decisions that actively affected my enjoyment of it near the very end as well. One particular aspect of the book that was sort of introduced in the first couple of chapters and then was never used again as a forefront aspect of the story, and was only ever brought up 1 or 2 times after that anyway, and only very minorly, and I was very disappointed because I wanted that element of the story to, be a much bigger part of it. Next up, we have Gregor the Overlander, the first book in the Underland Chronicles by Susan Collins. This is a favorite series of mine since junior high, the first time that I read the series, and then early high school when I reread the series again. I reread it recently and discovered that it actually holds up quite well. overall the series does. The first few books are a little bit more formulaic and a little bit more predictable and maybe not quite as sophisticated, but it does hold up for a middle grade novel. It is not a middle grade book that no adult could read or enjoy. It is a middle grade book that if you have kids in this age range, I recommend them to read it, or you read it with them, because there is surely something that they or you or both of you will enjoy from that experience. I'm going to put this at the bottom of pretty dang good because I quite enjoyed it. And next up, we have a mammoth, an absolute behemoth of a book, The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas, the first 300 pages of which I would contend are perfect, and the rest of the book satisfies basically all of the plot lines that happen. Maybe one of those plot lines concludes in ways that I wish was maybe a little bit better. Maybe one of those plot lines I wanted to see on page a little bit more. Maybe one of those plot lines I wished wasn't as forgettable in the time in between its introduction and its ultimate conclusion. But even regardless of the problems that I have with it, or the problems that other people have with it, because they are different problems. Some people don't like the Rome subplot very much, for example, but I really liked that section of the book. The Count of Monte Cristo is a very good book, and like I said, the first 300 pages of a, 1,300 page novel are indeed 100% perfect and are basically worth rereading all on their own just because of how good they are, regardless of all the plot that came afterwards. I think The Count of Monte Cristo is incredible and one of the pillars as to how classics can and should be read by more people these days. It is very approachable. The Robin Buss translation, which is the normal Penguin Classics version of the book, is very good, very readable, and a very smooth experience. You never have to worry about the language of the book because it just kind of flows so well. And part of this is also because Alexander Dumas isn't a particularly dense writer in the first place. He's writing more for the adventure and for the experience of the story itself, and that is definitely what Count of Monte Cristo is an experience. It deserves a place in cream of the crop. Next up is the second book of the Underland Chronicles, Gregor and the Prophecy of Bane, which I think is a little bit too similar to Gregor the Overlander. There are certain aspects of the character work that are expanded a bit because it had a little bit of time to do so, but overall it follows much the same structure and thematic tendencies, and basically the same prophecy storyline in ways that maybe aren't going to satisfy as much as Gregor the Overlander just inherently did as the first book of the series, even though it doesn't have to take as much time setting up the world, so it spends more time with the actual adventure itself, which I appreciate, but I'm going to go ahead and put it at the very top of Better Luck Next Time because it's just a hair below the quality that Gregor the Overlander as the first book was. Next up, what do we have next up is this, 127 Hours by Aaron Ralston. Sorry I asked that question because part of my camera monitor here is actually hiding the first book or two in the list that I have. So 127 Hours, Between a Rock and a Hard Place by Aaron Ralston, the autobiography of his time trapped between a rock and a hard place in the Moab desert, essentially. It's a very good book. I think the writing may not hold up the best. The writing itself and the prose isn't necessarily fantastic, but there are a couple passages that I thought were good. The experience of being in Aaron's head for all the time that he was trapped was very good, and the chapters intermingled in between these chapters, stuck in the canyon, were stories from Aaron's past that made him think differently about life and about people and about appreciating the gift of life and all this stuff. Even I appreciate those chapters a lot and think even they are worth reading. They aren't necessary for the book, but I think that they're still worth reading. At the very end of the book, maybe not the very end, like the last half of the book essentially, by the time the last of the flashback chapters to points from Aaron's to Aaron's past are over, by the time he's actually wrapping things up and starting to include chapters from, say, like family and friends POVs and stuff like that at the same time, when people discovered like, hey, Aaron's missing, maybe we should go find him, and the search kind of sort of begins. A lot of that is fantastic. I hold this book very near and dear to my life and kind of my past and middle school and stuff. It's a very special book to me, even though it's not the best book in the world. I'm going to go ahead and put it at the bottom of pretty dang good because it is a surprisingly enjoyable book, but maybe not one that everybody will love equally. The Card Turner is a very similar experience, very nostalgic from when I read it basically every year during the spring break time back in junior high school and high school and even middle school as well. It is not a complex book. It is a book about Bridge, the card game, which just, it's kind of a weird one. It's not one that everybody's going to love, but it is one that I really enjoy just for what it is. It's one of my guilty pleasure books as far as I am capable of having a guilty pleasure, because I don't really feel bad for the things that I enjoy or don't enjoy. But this is probably the closest that one comes, because I don't really have a reason per se why I love it so much, but it is absolutely a favorite. That's why I'm going to put it here in the middle, pretty dang good, because again, it's not like a perfect book that anybody's going to enjoy or that anybody who reads it could find something that get out of it, but it is one that I really adore nonetheless. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of part 1 of this tier list. This is the end of that ranking. You can kind of see how I tend to rank things a little bit generally. That is not to say that these rankings are, you know, equal or equivalent to any particular star rating, but you can kind of see the general trend that I tend to like a little bit more than I don't, and even things that I don't necessarily like as much, I still enjoy quite a bit, but maybe put down here because they don't quite make, you know, the reasons why I actively enjoy it so much the way that Pretty Dang Good does. But this is the end of part 1 of the tier list. Thank you guys for watching. I'll be back with part 2, covering another 10 or so books again next week. Thank you for watching. I'll be back in that video.